It only took 47 words, just 47 words posted at exactly 9:30 in the morning. And in that instant, the President of the United States announced that Canada, America's single most important trading partner, was effectively being shut off from the United States. Not merely a tariff increase, not simply a diplomatic caution or a stern warning, but an outright ban. Through one solitary social media post, Donald Trump declared a complete and immediate suspension of all non-essential trade and travel links between the United States and Canada. The measure, he stated, would take effect in precisely 72 hours unless Canada promptly signed an entirely new framework agreement on the spot. Let that reality settle in for just a moment. Every single day, roughly $2 billion worth of commerce flows back and forth across that shared border. 9 million American jobs, either directly or indirectly, rely on the strength and continuity of that economic relationship. For 70 full years, the two nations had built an extraordinarily deep level of economic integration. That integration had endured the immense pressures of multiple world wars, the prolonged strains of Cold War confrontations, several severe financial crises, and even the widespread disruptions caused by a global pandemic. Through every one of those historic challenges, not once did United States-Canada trade ever stop for even a single day. Yet now, according to nothing more than one brief social media message, that entire interwoven system was supposed to come to a screeching halt within just 3 short days. But then the narrative took a sharp and unexpected turn. At the very same moment that the post went live online, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney was already positioned at a podium inside Ottawa, conducting a scheduled live press conference. The event was being broadcast simultaneously across numerous prominent international networks: CBC for domestic viewers, BBC World for global English-speaking audiences, Reuters for business and wire service followers, CNN International for worldwide cable news watchers, with every television camera already in place and rolling. Then, in the middle of the ongoing session, a journalist's phone vibrated with an incoming notification. She immediately raised her hand to be recognized. In a packed briefing room filled with dozens of reporters and with live feeds transmitting the scene to audiences across the planet, she calmly read the contents of the tweet aloud for everyone to hear. Almost instantly, the room went completely silent. Every single camera lens swiveled and locked onto the Prime Minister standing at the podium. In that split second, Mark Carney had approximately 4 seconds, perhaps even less, to formulate and deliver a response to a sitting President of the United States who had just publicly announced via social media that Canada had effectively been banned from normal economic and travel relations with its southern neighbor. For a brief but intense instant, the entire press room seemed to freeze in place. No aides dashed forward with urgent notes. No whispered consultations took place behind the scenes. There was no opportunity to cut to a commercial break or shift to another segment. There was simply a Prime Minister standing alone at the lectern while billions of people around the world watched the unfolding moment in real time through their screens. The cameras zoomed in closer. Reporters instinctively leaned forward in their seats. Mark Carney drew one long, slow, deliberate breath, the precise kind of measured inhalation you only witness from someone who has spent decades successfully steering institutions through repeated financial crises. It was the sort of calm composure that quietly reassures both financial markets and foreign governments alike that outright panic will not be permitted to take root. Then he lifted his gaze directly into the array of lenses pointed at him and began to speak. "I have seen the post," he stated, his voice remaining steady, even, and entirely controlled. "Allow me to respond to it directly and clearly." The atmosphere in the room tightened noticeably. Every microphone in the vicinity captured the pivotal next sentence that would, within seconds, reverberate instantaneously around the entire globe. "A tweet," Carney declared, "is not a law." He delivered the line without the slightest trace of anger or theatrical flair, just a calm, almost clinical explanation that cut straight to the core issue. He continued without hesitation, ensuring the point landed with unmistakable precision. "A social media post," he elaborated, "does not possess any binding authority under the framework of American domestic law. It carries no enforceable weight within the structure of international treaty obligations. And it most certainly does not satisfy the necessary conditions required for an actionable measure under the established rules of the World Trade Organization." Canada, he made abundantly clear, had no intention whatsoever of reacting to or negotiating on the basis of a tweet. Canada would only engage with and respond to an official, formal legal instrument, if one actually existed, delivered through the appropriate and recognized diplomatic channels in the usual manner. A second reporter wasted no time in following up. Prime Minister, the journalist asked, are you effectively saying that Canada intends to simply ignore the President of the United States? The question hung noticeably in the charged air of the briefing room. Carney did not pause or waver for even a fraction of a second. He turned toward the questioner and replied with the identical calm precision he had maintained from the beginning. Canada applies exactly the same standard to every communication issued by any government anywhere in the world, he answered. If that communication possesses genuine legal standing and force, then we reply to it through formal diplomatic and legal processes. If it does not possess such standing, then we simply acknowledge its existence and we continue to carry out the normal business of governing our country. With that single, concise statement, delivered live and transmitted across international television feeds in real time, Canada's official position became crystal clear to everyone watching. The social media post might continue to dominate headlines and conversations across every platform online, but inside the corridors of power in Ottawa, the government was treating it precisely as what it was, political noise rather than anything resembling enforceable law. What happened immediately afterward demonstrated just how attentively and how rapidly the world's major financial markets were monitoring every development. The initial reaction did not begin on cable news commentary panels or in opinion segments. It began instead on the trading floors of Wall Street, inside foreign exchange dealing rooms, and across countless high-speed terminals used by professional investors and institutions scattered around the planet. Experienced traders never sit back and wait for television pundits or analysts to interpret unfolding events for them. They observe the incoming signals in real time, evaluate their credibility, and then adjust prices and positions to reflect the actual underlying reality as quickly as possible. And the signals emerging from that live Ottawa broadcast were impossible for any serious market participant to overlook or misinterpret. Within roughly 20 minutes of Mark Carney's measured response beginning to circulate widely across dedicated financial news networks and trading screens, the United States dollar had already declined by approximately 1.3% when measured against a broad basket of the world's major currencies. At virtually the same moment, gold prices surged noticeably higher. Treasury bond yields shifted in response. These movements were not merely knee-jerk reactions to headline-grabbing political theater. They represented something far more specific and calculated. Markets were pricing in the clear and widening gap between a dramatic presidential declaration issued through social media and the actual legal authority needed to make such a declaration enforceable in practice. Put another way, financial participants instantly recognized that two entirely contradictory messages were emanating from the very same story. On one side stood a United States president who had publicly issued an extraordinarily sweeping economic threat via nothing more substantial than a social media update, without citing any relevant statute, without issuing an accompanying executive order, and without making any formal declaration of a national emergency. On the opposing side stood a fellow G7 prime minister who, speaking live on international television, had calmly and methodically explained that such a post possessed no legal standing whatsoever, neither under American domestic statutes, nor under binding international treaty obligations, nor under the multilateral rules that govern global commerce. Whenever two such conflicting signals collide in real time on the world stage, financial markets do not hesitate or hedge. They quickly assess which signal carries genuine legal credibility and weight, and then they move capital accordingly. The resulting reaction propagated with remarkable speed. Within 40 minutes of Carney's remarks, finance ministers from three of the other major G7 economies, Germany, France, and Japan, had already placed direct calls to their counterparts in Ottawa. Later diplomatic readouts described those incoming messages as remarkably consistent in both tone and substance. Canada, the callers affirmed, clearly occupied the stronger and more defensible legal position in the matter. The integrity of the rules-based international trading system remained vitally important, and Ottawa's decision to regard the tweet as legally meaningless represented the only correct and appropriate procedural response under the circumstances. Meanwhile, over in London, the British Foreign Secretary released a carefully worded public statement in which she described the developing situation as deeply concerning, while simultaneously reaffirming the United Kingdom's long-standing commitment to the open international trading system, a framework, she pointedly reminded everyone, that the United States itself had played a leading role in designing and establishing several decades earlier. And before the morning had even drawn to a close on the North American side of the Atlantic, the European Union's commissioner responsible for trade matters had already convened an emergency coordination telephone call that included senior trade officials from Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. Pause and reflect on the significance of that development for just a second. The governments joining that urgent call were not traditional geopolitical adversaries of the United States. On the contrary, they were among Washington's closest and most reliable allies. Yet here they were, hurriedly convening to assess the implications of and to coordinate possible responses to an abrupt economic threat that had been publicly announced by the United States government itself. And that brings us squarely to the hard legal reality that began to assert itself like an immovable brick wall. Under the established framework of American law, a presidential tweet, no matter how sweeping, how dramatic, or how forcefully worded, carries precisely zero independent legal effect on its own. It does not qualify as an executive order. It does not constitute a formal presidential proclamation. It does not amount to an official declaration of a national emergency. It is not even recognized as a proper diplomatic communication transmitted through official channels. In plain terms, issuing a statement on social media does not magically confer upon the executive branch the unilateral authority required to sever what is by far the single largest bilateral trading relationship anywhere on the planet. For any action on that enormous scale to become legally operative, the president would need to invoke specific statutory powers clearly granted by Congress, adhere strictly to the procedural requirements embedded in those statutes, and issue a formal legal instrument capable of withstanding detailed scrutiny from federal courts, from congressional oversight committees, and from America's binding commitments under international trade agreements. That procedural threshold places the White House in an extraordinarily awkward and difficult position whenever an attempt is made to act through nothing more than a social media post. The various legal tools theoretically available to a president who wishes to restrict or suspend trade all come encumbered with stringent conditions and safeguards. Take, for example, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That statute explicitly requires a formal public declaration of a national emergency, followed by a clear and substantiated finding that a particular foreign country poses a genuine threat, either to United States national security interests or to the overall health of the American economy. Imagine for a moment the ferocious legal and political storm that would erupt if a United States president were suddenly to declare that Canada, a fellow member of the NATO alliance, a key partner in the NORAD Continental Defense Arrangement, and the nation that shares the longest continuously peaceful and undefended border anywhere on Earth, somehow constituted a national security threat to the United States. Leading constitutional scholars have repeatedly stated that any such declaration would almost certainly provoke immediate lawsuits in federal district courts and would very likely be enjoined or blocked entirely before it could ever be implemented. The other principal trade restriction authorities available to the executive branch are no easier to wield on short notice. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 permits the imposition of tariffs or other measures justified on national security grounds, but only after completion of a detailed and time-consuming investigation process managed by the Department of Commerce. Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 similarly authorizes retaliatory trade actions, but requires formal findings of unfair practices, extensive procedural steps, and consultation periods that routinely stretch across many months rather than a mere 72 hours. In summary, no clean, swift, or legally straightforward pathway existed that would allow the kind of comprehensive and immediate ban described in the social media post to take effect as a matter of enforceable law. That afternoon, Lawrence Tribe, the renowned Harvard University professor of constitutional law, appeared on national television and summarized the situation with characteristic bluntness. A trade ban that is merely announced through a social media post and that fails to cite any specific legal authority, he said, possesses precisely zero legal effect until and unless it is transformed into an actual formal action taken by the government in accordance with established statutory and constitutional procedures. Those words left the administration confronting a genuine dilemma that was simultaneously political in nature and deeply constitutional in character. And unfortunately for the White House, neither of the two available paths forward appeared particularly attractive or free of severe risks. And that very dilemma now occupied the absolute center of an inescapable 72-hour countdown. From the precise instant the original tweet was published, the clock had begun running relentlessly forward, and the administration suddenly discovered that it had maneuvered itself into a position trapped between two distinctly unappealing outcomes. Should the White House decide to follow through on the announced intention by issuing a formal executive order designed to implement the described ban, it would first be forced to identify and publicly cite a specific legal authority capable of justifying such sweeping action. The moment that statutory basis was named and made public, federal courts across the country would begin immediate and intensive scrutiny of its validity. Legal challenges from affected businesses, from states, from trade associations, and from Canadian entities would materialize almost instantaneously. Within a very short period, a federal judge could find himself or herself in the position of issuing a public ruling that explicitly defined, and potentially severely constrained, the outer boundaries of presidential authority to regulate international trade through unilateral action. For any administration that has consistently presented itself to the public as an embodiment of strength, decisiveness, and unchallenged dominance, the visual and political impact of a single district court judge halting its signature economic initiative in open court would be nothing short of devastating. Yet the alternative course, allowing the 72-hour period to expire without producing any formal legal instrument whatsoever, carries consequences that may prove equally damaging in both the short term and the long term. Should no executive order materialize, should no declaration of emergency be issued, should no relevant congressional action be requested or obtained, then an unavoidable conclusion would present itself to observers everywhere. The original tweet ultimately accomplished precisely nothing of legal substance. The so-called ban never possessed any genuine existence in the eyes of the law, and the straightforward observation Mark Carney delivered on live international television, that a tweet, standing alone, is not and cannot be considered a law, would be permanently etched into the historical record as the precise instant when the critical distinction between bold political messaging and actual enforceable legal authority was laid bare for the entire world to witness and evaluate. Precedents of that magnitude do not simply vanish once the immediate news cycle moves on to the next story. Other governments around the globe take careful note of what occurred. Financial markets commit the lesson to memory. And the next time any future American administration contemplates issuing a major economic threat solely by means of a social media post without accompanying legal formalities, finance ministries and central banks on every continent will instantly recall the precise sequence of events that unfolded here and draw the obvious conclusions. In the meantime, Canada has continued to advance its own carefully considered strategy without deviation or hesitation. Existing trade disputes are being actively progressed through the formal dispute resolution mechanisms established under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Strategic energy partnerships with key European markets are being actively expanded and deepened at an accelerated pace. Critical supply chains that were previously heavily oriented toward North American integration are steadily being redirected and diversified toward trusted partners located throughout the Asia-Pacific region. At every successive stage of this escalating confrontation, Canadian officials have consistently demonstrated faster reaction times, greater precision in both messaging and policy execution, and, most importantly, stronger and more defensible legal positioning than many observers in Washington had anticipated or prepared for. What is unfolding is not a series of improvised or reactive moves. It is instead the visible execution of a deliberate, thoroughly prepared, and well-rehearsed contingency strategy. That level of advanced preparation has enabled Canada to stare down a direct presidential threat delivered on the most public possible platform, to calmly and methodically explain on live international television precisely why that threat lacked any enforceable legal force, and then to continue the ordinary business of national governance without displaying the slightest sign of disruption or uncertainty. Right now, the entire world has its attention fixed firmly on the ticking clock. When that 72-hour deadline finally arrives and expires, one straightforward and unavoidable question will receive its definitive answer. Was the original 47-word social media post truly the opening salvo in what would become a historic and far-reaching trade confrontation between two of the world's closest allies? Or was it, instead, the precise moment when the outer limits of unilateral presidential power, when exercised solely through digital rhetoric without proper legal scaffolding, were dramatically and unmistakably revealed on the global stage for everyone to see and remember?